Welcome. My name is Sjostrom, and in this episode, we're going to be looking at short-term incentive plans. And like with all other episodes in this series of Getting Executive Compensation, we just take a high-level overview and we follow that with a few pointers as to what you may want to have a look at when you're evaluating or designing a short-term incentive plan. First then, for short-term incentives, what are they? What makes them short? Well, a rule of thumb is that we usually say anything that is covering a 12-month period or less, that would be a short-term incentive. There's a spectrum, of course, that we design incentives over, but the short-term ones are typically within the financial year, and they tend to have a focus that is more around the operational execution of the strategy than achieving strategic objectives as such, which tends to be more rewarded through long-term incentives. Not a rule, but it just tends to be that way. The way we design short-term incentives is by either applying a formula or a discretionary analysis of performance and then paying individuals for it or groups of individuals for it. And examples of short-term incentives are ranging from the broad all-employee based or large group linked profit shares or success shares to incentives that are designed specifically for a function, like sales incentives or project management incentives. Sales incentives, we tend to reward how many units or to what value the sales staff manage to bring in revenue. Whereas for project management, as another example, it's more around the timeliness of projects being completed to, and the cost efficiency and the quality of the project execution. But then we have the annual bonus plan, which is what is most typical for the executive population. And that is sometimes supplemented by another type of short-term incentive, which is the ad hoc recognition or ad hoc bonus, which means that you award individuals a one-off payment in recognition of something very exceptional they've done that wasn't really planned for or thought of at the beginning of the financial year. And it's really just a recognition payment. So when we put them together and design these short-term incentive plans, what we first of all look at is how much. So what are the opportunities that we're going to be offering individuals? And that can be determined in a currency format, or it can be determined as a percentage of the base salary, or it can be just linked to a result like a profit number, which may be translated into pools to be distributed across the organization or across the unit. What's important when we look at the opportunities is to consider what leverage do we put into the package that the individual is going to receive. So is there going to be a lot of predictable pay through fixed salary, base salary, or is there going to be a high leverage because a lot is uncertain because it's delivered through the short-term incentive or long-term incentive combination? We then need to set the links to performance. So short-term incentives are paid for something. Now, we may pay individuals for simply showing up to work. We may pay short-term incentive to just staying with the company, so-called retention bonuses. We may pay short-term incentives to come to the company, a recruitment bonus. But when we're looking at the broader set of incentives, there's usually some sort of performance link, which is brought back to the company or the unit or the individual and how they've done over the period that we measure. And those links then also need to determine how difficult it should be to earn different levels of pay. And those levels will be then linked to the constraints that we put around the short-term incentive. So the first constraint will be at what point do we pay at all? So at what point do we not pay below? And we can refer to that as the threshold level of pay. And the threshold may impact all of the incentive or just part of the incentive. And above it, then we start to pay, and we then usually want to define where the target or expected level of the incentive is. So if we perform to expectations, how much do we pay there? Now, it could be the same as the threshold level, could be the same as the next point, which is the maximum level, or it could be somewhere in between. So the maximum level, that is where do we cap the incentive? So at what level of performance do we not pay anymore? And it could of course be uncapped. It could be an infinite number, which has consequences. Or, as is more typical, in particular in Europe, we set a maximum performance level, and with it a maximum level of the short-term incentive. If you were to perform above that level, it simply wouldn't add to the value of the pay that you receive. Other constraints that we may put on the short-term incentive have become more and more popular in recent years. When I say recent years, after 2008 and the financial crisis, when the regulators of the financial services around the world started to insist on deferrals and clawback arrangements attached to short-term incentives. Interestingly, in particular, deferral arrangements were actually commonplace within much of the financial services sector beforehand. But what deferral is, and we'll talk more about it in a separate episode, is that you carve out part of the incentive, maybe any incentive above a certain number or a fixed percentage of the incentive that is being paid out, and you delay that payment either in cash or in shares or some other instrument until a future date, which might be a year away, might be 3 years away, or even longer. And what that allows you to do, which is then the next point to consider in the design, is you have a clawback ability that allows the company to take back some of the incentive or even all of the incentive, either by taking from the deferral or by coming and reclaiming already paid incentives and incentives to be paid if it turns out that a short-term incentive has been paid out based on information that was wrong. The things to consider when we're looking then at short-term incentives and evaluating them is first to just consider, is this in addition to or as part of expected reward? And this is a bit of a philosophical question, and it's a very important one, in particular for boards to be on top of, because this is an area where a lot of boards tend to have disagreements on the principles behind how and why incentives are paid. So one school of thought is that a bonus, as is implied by the word and the meaning of the word, is only paid for performance over and above the expected level of performance. So if you deliver to budget, you don't get anything. So if you have a profit sharing plan, for example, and you only just hit the budget, you wouldn't share any of the profits generated by that budget with the employees. If, on the other hand, you say that short-term incentives should, to a certain extent, be part of the expected reward, then what you do is you have a lower salary for the expected level of pay, and you make up the balance with part of the short-term incentive. So say, for example, you pay a third of the short-term incentive of it's an annual bonus, say, at the expected level of performance. This allows the company to shift some of the risk from the company onto the individual, and it does so by providing a bit of a premium in the incentive opportunity, so that the individual knows that, yes, if times are bad, the company can reduce its costs. Maybe we don't need to lay off so many people. And then when times are better, the individual can earn more, because then the company can afford to. And it is, is therefore a win for both sides, both shareholders and participants, if it's designed correctly. The next thing is to think about the balance of risk and reward. So how does the incentive encourage risk taking, and how much does it reward it? And then also, which is really key, is what is the probability of earning different levels, including what are the extremes that this incentive may deliver. We have a problem, and it's actually even bigger problem with long-term incentives, but short-term incentives too. We look at what's the probability of getting something, and say we expect the target level to be the one that pays out. But if we get the probabilities around pay and performance wrong, it can be quite dramatic. So if the board is not clear on how much value the maximum may pay out to an individual, it may be that it gets embroiled in a scandal around it. In particular, if you have uncapped incentives, if you have an incentive where you set the targets as way too tough, so they're basically unachievable, then you will have an organization that quickly catches on to that the bonus opportunity is not what the company says, but it's actually much less, which will mean that they will devalue the incentive and any incentive into the future, which can have consequences for retention and indeed general satisfaction amongst the executive population. The last thing I just wanted to bring up as a flag for short-term incentives is signaling. When we're talking about short-term incentives, there's often no debate around how do they work. Do they work at all? And we have this mantra that has developed around paying people for performance, and secondly, to attract and retain and motivate executives through the packages that we have. And the motivation point often gets brought up around short-term incentives. Do they motivate individuals? And there's a worryingly large number of so-called academic studies that claim that short-term incentives do not motivate, and therefore they do not work. Everybody is motivated by money, and therefore short-term incentives can motivate people absolutely. The big issue is that we do not know how different individuals are motivated by money. Some people will quite happily stab their grandmother for $5, and others will not sign a piece of paper for $1 million. We all have different perspectives. We have different personal wealth situations. We have different moral compasses. We have different value systems. We have different ways of looking at what is important in life, what is right, what is wrong. Clearly, if we take away an individual's money and then offers them a little bit of money for food at some point, the sort of most basic Hertzberg kind of level, yes, they'll be motivated directly to take money in order to survive. But that's not really how it works at an executive level. So we cannot rely on short-term incentives or any other executive pay vehicle to deliver motivation. Motivation shouldn't be a part of executive compensation design at all. What should be part of it is signaling. Because even if you are not directly motivated by your short-term incentive to do more, you do understand through the short-term incentive what it is that the organization wants you to do. What are the actions and the behaviors that you need to exhibit and perform on in order to deliver on the strategy and the tasks that you have been employed to do. That we can signal very, very clearly through the short-term incentive in ways that we cannot rely on necessarily through other means. I mean, you could alternatively have management communicate this. You could have all sorts of other parts of the organization sending signals, and you should do that. But if you use the short-term incentive and long-term incentive, indeed other parts of reward, like we can signal very clearly through benefits, our intents and our views around things like environmental approaches, how we care about the individual's well-being and so on. So if we use pay, then we can get some very, very clear signals through. And the short-term incentive, it signals the actions and behaviors that we want to see and the actions and behaviors that we do not want to see. So the other aspect of this is, do we pay for and signal the wrong things? Short-term incentives work. They pay for what you reward. So the signal tends to be very clear. If you, however, signal the wrong thing, so you say you'll pay for profit, but you don't actually want profit, you want growth or new inventions or whatever, then you are going to get profits and not the new inventions and the growth. You have to have a signal that is conscious and well thought through, and that is what's going to make the short-term incentive successful. I hope this has been helpful to you. I hope you now feel a little bit more about why companies operate short-term incentives, and I hope you'll join me in other episodes of Getting Executive Compensation, where we'll continue to look at how executive compensation all comes together. My name is Sjostrom, and thank you for listening.